Grey Rock was the kind of place people drove through slowly, not because of traffic, but because the scenery felt like a postcard brought to life. Wide palm trees lined every street, the ocean was never more than a short walk away, and the neighborhood sparkled with expensive homes guarded by perfectly trimmed hedges. It was a town for the wealthy, a place where people smiled politely while measuring one another's status by the size of their homes, their lawns, and their monthly social calendars. And in the middle of this world stood the Menendez mansion, a sprawling estate on a hill with wide marble steps, glass windows stretching from floor to ceiling, and a garden that seemed too perfect to belong to the real world. To anyone passing by, the Menendez family looked untouchable. Edward Menendez had built his fortune through property development, turning small land plots into towering hotels and apartment complexes that generated millions. He was respected, feared, and admired. When he walked into a room, people made space. His voice carried confidence, the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had risen from nothing and had no intention of ever falling back down again. His wife Helena was the softer face of the family. Slim, elegant, always dressed as though photographers might appear at any moment, she was known for her charity events, her expensive jewelry, and her calm expression that never cracked, not even under pressure. She shook hands with politicians, hosted massive fundraising dinners, and seemed to exist in a world where real problems simply did not reach her doorstep. Together, they were the couple others wanted to become. Their sons, Michael and Adrian, were the final pieces of the perfect picture. Michael, the older at 20, was smart, composed, and trained to follow his father's business footsteps. He spoke with confidence, dressed like a young executive, and carried himself like someone who already understood the rules of the world. Adrian, 18, was quieter. He was taller but moved with less certainty, often glancing at his brother or parents before speaking, as if expecting correction. He liked art, music, and quiet afternoons, things that Edward found useless and childish. Still, the family's image remained flawless. To outsiders, the Menendez household was stable, successful, enviable. But houses, especially large quiet ones, have ways of hiding secrets. People in Grey Rock occasionally wondered why the mansion lights stayed on late into the night. Some heard raised voices echo from the open windows when the breeze blew just right. Others noticed the boys rarely smiled when their parents were around. But curiosity did not survive long in a wealthy neighborhood. People preferred polite conversations, not uncomfortable truths. The Menendez family presented wealth, respectability, and glamour. That was what people wanted to see. They did not ask what happened when the front doors closed and silence returned to the vast, echoing rooms. Inside the house, the atmosphere was different. Edward ran his home like a company. Rules were strict, schedules were fixed, mistakes were not tolerated. Meals were formal, conversations controlled, and affection treated like a weakness. Michael learned early how to survive in that environment by removing emotion from his decisions. He practiced answers before speaking, double-checked his actions, and never gave Edward a reason to criticize him. Adrian struggled more. His father's demands weighed on him. He often stayed up late studying not because he wanted to succeed, but because failure meant consequences. And failure, in the Menendez household, was not a small thing. The boys were not allowed many friends. People who came to the house left quickly, sensing the tension that lay beneath the polished surface. Even family photos looked staged, with forced smiles and stiff poses, as though no one wanted to be caught in a moment that looked too real. Helena rarely intervened. She watched, managing the home's image more than the lives within it. She had grown used to her husband's dominance, and perhaps she had convinced herself that silence was the best way to survive it. Michael and Adrian did not share their feelings with anyone. They had each other, but even between them words were cautious. They learned to move quietly, think quickly, and avoid mistakes. Fear became a routine part of life, the kind no one on the outside could see. And so the family maintained its reputation. Edward attended business conferences with photographs taken beside city leaders. Helena continued her charity events, each one written about in local magazines. Michael and Adrian went to school in perfect suits and returned home on time, never questioning the routine that ruled their lives. Everything stayed balanced, held in place by discipline and silence. But balance rarely lasts forever. On a warm July evening, the quiet perfection shattered. At 10:16 p.m., the Grey Rock Emergency Center received a panic call. The voice on the other end trembled, struggling to stay coherent. It was Michael, barely able to breathe, saying the words that would become the start of the most shocking investigation the town had ever seen. He told the operator that he and Adrian had just returned home from movies. They found the front door open, the living room in chaos, and their parents lying motionless. He begged for help, saying someone must still be in the house, maybe waiting to attack them too. Police cars raced through the quiet Grey Rock streets, sirens cutting through the peaceful night. When officers arrived, they found Michael and Adrian outside the mansion, pale and shaking. Inside, the bodies of Edward and Helena were discovered in the living room, shot multiple times. The room was bloody but strangely undisturbed. Furniture was untouched. Decorations on shelves remained neatly aligned. A single glass had fallen to the floor, but nothing looked stolen. The air still smelled of gunpowder. Officers scanned the halls and found no intruders, no open windows, no evidence of forced entry. The security alarm was turned off. The mansion felt frozen, the silence almost heavy. The neighbors, awakened by the patrol lights, watched from behind fences and front lawns. Shock spread quickly as officers and detectives entered and left the house. No one had ever seen scandal touch the Menendez estate. By sunrise, the news was circulating across Grey Rock. A perfect family, admired and respected, had been destroyed inside their own home. The town mourned. People sent flowers, offered condolences, and whispered theories behind closed doors. Some suggested a robbery gone wrong. Others believed it was someone with a grudge against Edward's business empire. Few considered the possibility that the truth was much more complex. Detective Harper, who took charge of the case, stood in the living room that morning and looked at the precise arrangement of objects untouched by chaos. Something felt off. Something felt planned. The bodies, the lack of forced entry, the calm condition of the house, nothing matched the scene of a random burglary. But for the moment, the brothers were treated as grieving sons who had stumbled into a nightmare. Michael sat on the front steps, staring blankly ahead, his face tight and unreadable. Adrian cried openly, trembling each time someone approached. Officers took their statements, offered blankets, and tried to calm them. Outwardly, they were victims. Inwardly, Harper sensed there was more to uncover. That night, while the brothers stayed with relatives and reporters swarmed the estate gates, Grey Rock tried to understand how a family that looked perfect on the outside could end its story in such a violent and mysterious way. And though no one knew it yet, the shocking truth about the Menendez murders was only beginning to surface. Detective Harper had worked murders for almost 20 years, yet something about the Menendez case unsettled him from the beginning. When he first stepped inside the mansion, stepping over the polished white floors and expensive rugs, he felt the atmosphere of a house that had spent years pretending. Everything was too perfect, too silent, too controlled. It did not feel like a home broken into by criminals. It felt like a crime committed by someone who already belonged there. In interviews, Michael and Adrian repeated the same version of events. They said they had gone out to watch a movie and returned home to find the front door open and their parents dead. Their voices trembled in the recordings. Their eyes filled with tears. Their hands shook as they described their shock and fear. But Harper had seen real grief before, and something in their reactions didn't quite match. Michael cried, yet his breathing stayed steady. Adrian sobbed but made sure never to say anything his brother had not already said. Their stories were aligned too perfectly, like rehearsed lines in a school play. Harper felt the gap between their emotional expressions and their tightly controlled statements. When officers searched the house, they found nothing missing. Wallets, jewelry, electronics, even Helena's diamond necklace collection remained untouched. The security system showed no alerts. The windows were locked. The back gate was closed. A burglar does not usually enter a mansion and leave without taking a single valuable item, especially not in a house where even the smallest ornament could be sold for thousands of dollars. It looked staged. Too clean, too precise, almost like a set arranged for performance. Still, suspicion alone was not enough. Harper needed facts, evidence, and something more concrete than instinct. When autopsies came back, they confirmed that Edward and Helena had been shot several times at close range. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting they had either been taken by surprise or had trusted their killer enough not to react. Harper walked through the mansion hallway alone late that evening, imagining the final moments. Edward sitting in his expensive armchair, Helena beside him, television playing softly, maybe unaware of the danger until the gun was raised. There were no overturned tables, no scratches on the floor, no frantic handprints made on walls. Just two bodies positioned calmly in the living room, as if death had arrived without resistance. Harper went to the movie theater where the boys claimed they had been. They had indeed purchased tickets, but they had left halfway through the film. Both brothers had returned to their car together and driven away before the movie ended. They could not explain why they left early, giving vague reasons that did not satisfy the detective. More inconsistencies surfaced in the following days. Instead of grieving in isolation, the brothers were seen shopping at high-end stores barely a week after the murders. They purchased expensive watches, tailored suits, and designer shoes. One store clerk told officers that the boys spent money like someone who had just inherited a fortune. Politely, Harper asked whether their parents normally gave them such freedom. The clerk shook his head. The brothers also checked into luxury hotels, eating expensive dinners, ordering champagne, and even booking spa sessions. Harper sat in his office reviewing credit card receipts that looked less like coping mechanisms and more like celebration. He knew teenagers and young adults handled trauma differently, but this spending pattern was not normal grief. It looked like relief, even reward. When officers interviewed friends and classmates, subtle details emerged. Some people described Adrian as anxious and easily upset. Others said Michael was distant and controlled, someone who planned every move in advance. One student recalled a comment Adrian had made only months before the murders, complaining quietly that his father never let them make their own decisions. Another acquaintance remembered Michael making a strange joke after seeing an expensive car advertisement, saying he might be able to afford it sooner than expected. Individually, such comments could be harmless, but when placed alongside two dead parents, a sudden inheritance worth millions, and signs of calm spending, they became troubling. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Harper knew the pressure on him was growing. Local news stations were covering the case daily, painting the brothers as tragic victims. People in town were sending sympathy letters and flowers. Greyrock's wealthy community wanted the story to be simple: a violent intruder, an unlucky family, and a tragedy with no deeper meaning. But behind that narrative, Harper felt cracks spreading. He interviewed Helena's closest friend, a woman who attended every charity event with her. When asked whether Helena had ever mentioned stress at home, the woman hesitated. She said that the last time she saw Helena, only 3 days before her death, she had seemed distracted and nervous, touching her necklace repeatedly during a conversation as if seeking comfort. When asked if Helena ever talked about Edward's temper, the woman looked down and avoided giving a direct answer. Silence sometimes said more than testimony. Harper also interviewed one of Edward's business partners. The man was smooth, confident, and eager to maintain the company's image. He claimed Edward had no enemies, no business conflicts, no reason anyone would want him dead. But when the conversation turned to Edward as a father, the partner shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, clearing his throat, admitting that Edward was strict at home and expected absolute obedience. Harper noticed everything. Police confiscated the family weapons cabinet. Edward collected firearms, all perfectly maintained and locked. One handgun was missing. No one could say who last had access to it. Harper asked the brothers directly. They insisted they had not touched the guns and had no idea one was missing. But he watched their body language. Michael's eyes did not flinch. Adrian swallowed hard before speaking. Harper kept pushing, slowly tightening the pressure, waiting for even a small crack. The house remained a silent witness. Officers returned to sweep for new evidence. In one room, Adrian's desk held a notebook with sketches, song lyrics, and writings that hinted at someone trapped, someone dreaming of escape. Harper did not know whether those writings were emotional expression or confession in disguise. Still, they remained circumstantial. The investigation continued, and public opinion began to shift. Rumors spread. Some citizens wondered whether the brothers had secrets. Others defended them, insisting that grief affected people differently, especially young men raised under pressure. A week after the crime, Harper reviewed the case brought alone, looking at photographs of the house, the parents, the boys, statements, reports, autopsy findings. Something connected them all, but the thread was still invisible. Then a new detail emerged. Security footage from a gas station showed Michael and Adrian filling their car tank not long after leaving the movie theater early. Their faces showed no panic, no urgency. They laughed with the station attendant and looked relaxed. It did not match their later performance on the 911 call, where they sounded terrified and breathless. Harper played the footage repeatedly. He saw two boys who knew that, at that moment, their parents were already dead. The investigation gained quiet momentum. Officers placed the brothers under subtle surveillance. They tracked their movements, phone activity, financial behavior. The spending increased. The routines continued, and the brothers became more comfortable, as if they believed they were safe. Then, late one night, Harper received a phone call. A therapist had reported that Adrian had canceled 2 sessions because he claimed he was too overwhelmed with everything. The therapist also mentioned that Adrian seemed on the brink of a breakdown, unable to hold himself together. Harper recognized the moment he had been waiting for. Stress breaks the guilty first. The younger brother was cracking under pressure, and Harper knew that if anyone was going to talk, it would be Adrian, not Michael. The detective prepared his next move. The case was not solved yet, but history had taught him one thing. When a secret is held by 2 people, it is never safe for long. Detective Harper understood human behavior better than most. He had watched suspects lie, break down, rebuild their stories, and eventually collapse under the weight of guilt. He had learned something valuable from all those years. When 2 people commit a crime together, the stronger one protects the secret while the weaker one slowly drowns in it. From the very beginning, Harper knew Michael was the stronger brother. His face stayed composed even during the raw days following the murders. He answered carefully, never adding unnecessary details, always speaking in firm, controlled sentences. Adrian was different. His eyes drifted when questions grew uncomfortable, his breathing tightened, and his hands trembled whenever police mentioned evidence. Harper did not need proof to know which brother would break first. He only needed time. He began the process quietly, in ways that never drew attention. He arranged interviews with each brother separately, requesting clarifications on their statements, pointing out small contradictions, pretending to be looking for innocent explanations. When he spoke to Michael, the older brother rarely reacted. He sat straight, expression flat, and answered as though discussing a school assignment. Harper pressed gently, knowing that pushing too hard could make Michael shut down completely. When the detective mentioned the missing gun from the family collection, Michael did not blink. He simply said he did not know anything about it. He did not ask questions, did not react with surprise, did not even appear offended. That lack of emotional response was a response in itself. Adrian, on the other hand, struggled to maintain composure. Harper would ask the same routine question and Adrian's shoulders would tense, his throat would tighten, and his voice would lose steadiness. The detective used that difference. He would close the door, sit across from Adrian in the soft-lit interview room, and speak calmly, almost gently, as though he wanted to protect him from something heavy that was coming. He told Adrian he understood how difficult it must be to live with trauma. He hinted that secrets could eat away at people. He mentioned that sometimes, one person ends up carrying more weight than the other. He never directly accused him, but he planted seeds and let silence fill the room until Adrian's eyes flickered with panic. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian began to unravel. His friends told officers he was barely sleeping, skipping meals, pacing at night, unable to concentrate. His grades dropped. Teachers said he appeared distracted, staring out windows as if expecting something terrible to enter the classroom at any moment. Harper's goal was not to trap him, but to let reality do the pressure work. All the detective did was offer the slightest push when Adrian was already leaning. On a rainy Thursday evening, the breakthrough happened. Adrian showed up at the police station alone, without calling first, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes red, as if he had spent hours crying before he even arrived. The front desk officer immediately notified Harper, who met Adrian in a quiet interrogation room. The young man sat down, shaking so hard he had to grip the edge of the metal table to steady himself. Harper offered him water, speaking softly, almost like a parent rather than a detective. Adrian stayed at the cup but did not drink. For a moment, he said nothing. Then the words came out, broken, cracked, soaked in fear. "We didn't go out to the movies to get away," he finally said. "We went out so it would look like we weren't home." The weight of that confession settled into the air. Harper did not interrupt. He knew once a dam opens, floodwaters pour out on their own. Adrian continued with shaking breath. He said their father had ruled the house through fear, that their mother had chosen silence rather than protection. The brothers had grown up in a world where every mistake was punished, every emotion policed. Adrian described Edward as a man whose standards were impossible to meet, whose anger could fill the house like smoke, thick enough to choke anyone who lived inside it. He talked about conversations that happened behind closed doors, about tension that never left the house, and about never feeling safe. Harper listened, taking mental notes, careful not to react emotionally. Adrian said they felt cornered, hopeless, convinced that no one on the outside would ever believe them if they spoke up. He insisted that their father's power in the business community was too strong, his influence too wide. Speaking out, he believed, would only bring more punishment. Michael, he said, was the one who finally broke. One night, after another explosive argument, Michael found one of their father's guns and told Adrian he couldn't endure another day. He proposed a plan. Adrian said he refused at first, terrified of what they were even considering. But Michael didn't back down. He said they could never have lives of their own unless they took control. Adrian, worn down by years of silent fear, eventually agreed. He could barely speak as he described the night of the murders. He said they waited until Edward and Helena were sitting in the living room watching television. Michael carried the gun, and Adrian followed, heart beating so loudly he thought his parents could hear it even from across the room. Adrian admitted he could barely see what was happening when the first shots rang out. His ears froze, his body locked, his senses overloaded. Michael fired again and again, making sure the job was done quickly, efficiently, fatally. Afterwards, the brothers staged a break-in. They knocked down a few items, opened the front door, and then left the house. They drove to the movie theater, bought tickets, sat through half the film, then returned home pretending to discover the bodies for the first time. As Adrian finished his story, he collapsed into sobs, shoulders shaking, face buried in his hands. Harper let him cry. Men who commit violent crimes do not always feel relief in confession, but Adrian looked like someone who had been holding a burning weight inside his chest for months. Still, Harper knew something Adrian said needed closer inspection. The boy insisted the violence in the house was deeper than anyone could understand, deeper than he could express. He struggled to find words, saying only that their father controlled everything, even their hearts, even their futures. He hinted at emotional and psychological torment, years of strict discipline, locked doors, routines enforced with punishments that left scars no one could see. Harper asked him if there had ever been physical injuries. Adrian hesitated, looking at the door as if expecting someone to burst in and punish him. Then he said softly that bruises were not the worst part. The fear was. The constant threat. The feeling that nothing they did could ever be enough. Harper ended the questioning gently, knowing that pushing too deep in this first confession might make Adrian retreat. He took notes, sealed the recording, and formally logged the confession into evidence. But even as he signed the paperwork, something nagged at him. Adrian said he and Michael had committed the murders alone, but some things did not line up. The security logs, the timing of the shots, and small traces at the scene hinted at the possibility that someone else might have been involved. Adrian, exhausted and raw, insisted there had been no third person. Still, Harper's instincts whispered otherwise. When the brothers were arrested the next morning, Grey Rock exploded. The media screamed betrayal. Neighbors were stunned. Some refused to believe the boys were capable of murdering their parents. Others claimed they had suspected something was wrong for years but had never dared speak about it. In the transport car on the way to jail, the brothers sat side by side but did not speak. Michael stared out the window, jaw clenched. Adrian sat trembling, head down, hands cuffed in his lap. Harper watched them through the reinforced glass and felt the heavy truth of the case settle into his bones. Two young men from a house of wealth had carried a secret violent enough to destroy everything they had been born into. But the detective also knew that criminal cases are never as simple as the first confession. There were still unanswered questions, pieces that did not fit, shadows in the story that Adrian's words did not illuminate. Something remained beneath the surface, and Harper promised himself he would not stop until he reached it. The discovery of the storage locker contents sent a wave of shock through everyone involved in the investigation, but it was Detective Sarah Langston who felt the weight of it most heavily. She had been on the force for over 12 years, but no case had ever twisted its way into her thoughts the way this one did. Ever since the first body had been found in the abandoned house, she had sensed that she was dealing with someone who operated with patience and calculation, someone who did not simply act on impulse. Yet nothing could have prepared her for what waited inside that dusty metal storage unit on the edge of town. The lockbox, the photos, the journals, and the chilling voice recordings were not just evidence, they were windows into the killer's mind. As the team worked through the night cataloging every item, Sarah sat at the metal table in the precinct's evidence room listening through the first recording, headphones pressed tight against her ears, her hand gripping the side of the chair as the distorted voice on the tape spoke calmly about the first abduction. It was the controlled tone that unsettled her most. There was no rage, no panic, no emotional turbulence. Whoever the killer was, they believed what they were doing was necessary, justified, even righteous. Sarah had always believed that the most dangerous people were not the ones who killed spontaneously, but the ones who could sleep at night after doing it. As she listened, she could feel that this case was crossing a threshold. Up until now they had been reacting to evidence, trying to reconstruct the killer's movements and motives, but this new material gave them something far more disturbing: insight. The journals were filled with handwritten observations about people, society, decay, failure, and justice. The author described the victims not as individuals but as broken pieces of a machine that needed restoration. Pages detailed patterns of behavior, rituals, dates, scouting notes, and philosophical justifications. It was methodical, structured, and horrifying. The killer had likely been documenting their actions for years, maybe even before the first known murder, which meant that the case might stretch back further than the police initially realized. The implications weighed heavily on Sarah's thoughts as she flipped through page after page, feeling as though the voice of the killer was speaking directly to her. At the same time, tension was growing outside of the station. News of the latest discovery had been leaked to the press, and within hours reporters were storming the precinct steps demanding statements. The town, already shaken, was on edge. Parents were pulling their children from schools, businesses were closing early, and citizens who had once felt comfortable leaving doors unlocked were now triple-checking every window latch before bed. Fear was slowly becoming a normal part of daily life. Panic bred speculation, and speculation was beginning to turn neighbors against one another. Local forums, radio hosts, and social media threads were filled with theories, accusations, and growing anger that police had not acted sooner. The public did not know the depth of the case, could not see the evidence the detectives were sorting through, and Sarah knew that they would not understand even if they did. There was a difference between knowing a killer existed and truly seeing the world the killer lived in. Once you stepped inside that darkness, it was hard not to bring pieces of it back out with you. As Sarah and the task force worked, one piece of evidence stood out more than anything else: a picture taken by the killer that had not yet matched any known crime scene or missing person case. The victim in the photograph was a young woman, bound and terrified, sitting in what looked like a basement with stone walls and a low vaulted ceiling. Sarah stayed at the image for a long time, studying every pixel, every shadow. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 3 weeks earlier, long before the latest remains had been found. If the woman was still alive somewhere, then this case had shifted from solving a murder spree to racing against time to save a life. Sarah felt an urgency burning through her veins, and she and the team immediately began analyzing the photograph for any identifiable details. The stone walls appeared old, likely historic, suggesting that the location might be one of the older buildings outside the modern edges of town. The faint presence of what looked like rusted pipes overhead meant the basement was probably part of a structure initially built before updated construction codes. Sarah pulled out a map and started circling locations that fit the architecture while the rest of the team sent digital copies to specialists for enhancement. But one question lingered in Sarah's mind, one that she found herself returning to over and over. Why had the killer kept this photograph? Why had they not disposed of it the way they seemed to do with other scenes and victims? Everything else about the killer's behavior suggested meticulous cleanup and intentional disappearance of evidence. So why leave this behind? Sarah began considering the possibility that the killer wanted them to find it. Maybe this new discovery was part of a larger game or a test. Maybe the killer was watching them, guiding them, or daring them to catch up. That thought sent a chill down her spine. She glanced around the precinct, suddenly hyper-aware of the sense that they were being observed. It would not be the first time a serial offender incited themselves into the investigation, but this killer had taken the concept to an unnerving level. They were not leaving taunts or letters, they were leaving breadcrumbs hidden inside their own obsession, as though inviting the police into the labyrinth of their mind. As the night dragged on, The voices in the recordings revealed more chilling details. The killer spoke about selecting victims based on perceived failures, calling them test cases. They spoke of wanting to fix society, to cleanse it, to reshape it through fear and removal. Sarah removed her headphones and rubbed her eyes, thinking about how someone could come to see themselves not as a murderer but as an architect of a better world. Such thinking was not born from chaos but from delusion shaped by time, anger, and most of all, isolation. The killer had not snapped. The killer had evolved. That was the most unsettling truth of all. Somewhere along the way, society had missed a transformation. Someone had lived near this person, spoken to them, maybe even worked beside them, and had no idea of the storm raging inside. What Sarah did not know, what she could not yet see, was that while she sat piecing together clues, the killer was already preparing for the next stage. They were not going to stop, not because they lacked the desire to do so, but because they believed they had only just begun. And if Sarah and her team did not act quickly, another photograph might soon join the files in the evidence room, another life lost to the darkness that had slowly begun to swallow the town whole. The following days unfolded with a growing sense of pressure that settled like a weight on the chest of every detective in the department, but none felt it more deeply than Sarah. Each passing hour without progress meant that the woman in the photograph was potentially slipping further out of reach, and the fear of losing her became a shadow that followed Sarah everywhere she went. She had always prided herself on staying emotionally separated from her cases, believing that empathy was necessary but attachment was dangerous. Yet this time she could not shake the feeling that the clock was ticking not just on a case, but on her obligation to another human being who might still be alive. She worked through nights fueled by burnt coffee and the growing strain of too little sleep, her desk cluttered with maps, photographs, reports, and sketches. The basement walls from the photograph had become something she saw even when she closed her eyes, their rough stone texture imprinted on her memory. The team had begun cross-referencing old construction records, property listings, historical documents, and municipal archives. The type of stone in the photograph was not common in modern construction, which narrowed down the search to older districts. The detective's office soon felt like a war room, with red marker circles spreading across maps like the slow bloom of infection in a body. Sarah's partner, Detective Michael Reyes, had become her right hand during this phase of the investigation. He was younger and less seasoned, but he had an instinctive ability to connect data points that others missed. Together, they sifted through blueprints and survey scans, searching for any location that could match the structure seen in the photograph. Still, something about the image gnawed at Sarah. The basement did not have the look of a residential property. The vaulted arch in the ceiling and the weathered stone suggested architecture that served more utilitarian purpose, perhaps storage or even something industrial. It was not until Reyes suggested looking into old transport buildings that Sarah felt a spark in her mind. The town had once been a thriving transportation hub decades earlier, with interconnected tunnels and storage areas beneath some of the older stations. Many of these had been abandoned and sealed off from public access when modernization took place. If one of these underground structures had been illegally reopened or remained forgotten, it would make an ideal location for someone who needed secrecy and isolation. The team shifted their focus and soon unearthed a list of railway properties sold off over the last 30 years, some purchased by private owners who had never undergone inspections on new development. One in particular stood out, an old supply warehouse that had been auctioned off in quiet proceedings and never used again. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she read the land records. The initial inspection had noted the presence of a stone basement beneath the main floor, though it was marked as unsafe and sealed. If the killer had found access or had prior knowledge of the location, it might explain how they managed to operate undetected. She knew they had to get inside. Before a warrant could be issued, Sarah met with the district attorney, who listened as she laid out her reasoning with a controlled but urgent tone. The DA could see the logic, but the lack of direct proof made approval difficult. Sarah countered that waiting for more evidence might cost a woman her life. After hours of discussion, the search authorization was signed. The moment Sarah held the document in her hand, she felt the weight shift. For the first time in days, they were no longer reacting but moving forward. She assembled a tactical team and briefed them personally, outlining the risks, the possibility that the suspect might be present, and the critical need to prioritize any hostage safety. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt the tension winding tighter. They arrived at the warehouse under the gray sky of early morning. The building loomed like a relic from another era, its brickwork cracked and faded, the windows dark and lifeless. The air smelled of rain-soaked rust as the officers surrounded the perimeter. Sarah and Reyes moved to the front entrance, their flashlights cutting through the dusty darkness as they stepped inside. The interior was cavernous, filled with broken shelves, collapsed staircases, and the remnants of forgotten machinery. Rays of sunlight pierced through gaps in the roof, catching drifting particles that shimmered like dust suspended in time. For a moment it felt like the building was holding its breath. They found the sealed trapdoor beneath a section of warped floorboards, just as indicated in the old structural documents. Someone had broken the seal long ago. Sarah exchanged a tense look with Reyes before signaling the team. They descended the narrow stone steps, the air growing colder and more stale with every step. The hallway below was silent, save for the echoing footsteps of the officers. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, her senses alert to every detail. The stone architecture here matched the photograph perfectly. They moved forward, clearing each chamber with weapons drawn, flashlights sweeping across walls covered in dripping mineral deposits and patches of mold. Then Sarah saw it. A heavy metal door stood at the end of one hall, secured with multiple locks. Her breath caught. Reyes stepped forward with bolt cutters, breaking through the first lock with a metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot through the basement. The final lock fell away, and Sarah pushed the door open. The beam of her flashlight crossed the room and landed on a woman lying on a stained mattress, bound at the wrists and ankles, her eyes wide with terror. When she saw the officers, relief broke across her expression so suddenly that she began to sob uncontrollably. Sarah rushed to her side, cutting through the restraints and wrapping a blanket around her trembling shoulders. She checked her pulse, weak but present. The woman whispered a hoarse thank you before collapsing into Sarah's arms. As the medics arrived and escorted the woman to safety, Sarah took in the rest of the room. The walls were lined with more photographs, diagrams, handwritten notes, and symbols. It felt like stepping into the center of the killer's mind. There were documents detailing previous victims, but more chillingly, there were future plans, steps outlined for actions not yet taken. The killer was not improvising. They were executing a structured mission in their own mind, and the woman they had just saved was only the next phase in a continuation that would have escalated if they had not intervened. But something else struck Sarah then, something that made her spine stiffen. There was no sign of the killer. Whoever had been using this place had vanished before they arrived, and not in haste. There were no dropped tools, no abandoned equipment, no signs of panic or sudden flight. It was as if the killer had anticipated they would be there. On the far wall, written in careful strokes of black ink, was a short message: "You were expected." Sarah stayed at the words, feeling a chilling realization settle in. The killer was not running. They were leading. And this rescue, successful as it was not the end of the case but the beginning of a far more dangerous game. The tactical team continued searching, but the warehouse yielded no further clues. As Sarah walked back up the stone stairwell into the weak daylight, she realized the victory felt empty. They had saved a life, but the killer had slipped through their fingers like smoke. Outside, reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing as officers shielded the rescued woman. Sarah said nothing to the press. She kept her eyes on the horizon, replaying every step of the investigation in her mind. How long had the killer been watching? How close had they come to meeting face to face? Sarah knew there would be another move soon, another message, another victim if they failed to get ahead. For the first time in her career, she felt that she was not chasing a killer but being invited into a puzzle crafted by someone who believed themselves smarter than the system hunting them. And deep down she understood that the next move would likely determine more than just the outcome of the case. It might determine the fate of anyone who stood in the path of the killer's violent vision of justice.